I'm Sandra Dee. It's such fun living in California and being able to pick fresh flowers for my hair.
What if I told you that one of Hollywood's most innocent sweethearts had a secret romance that would change everything? What if the girl everyone thought they knew was hiding a passionate love story that Hollywood tried to control? Today, we're diving deep into Sandra Dee's shocking memoir revelations about her relationship with heartthrob Troy Donaghy. And trust me, you won't believe what she finally admitted after all these years. Picture this. It's 1960, and Sandra Dee is sitting across from the most gorgeous man in Hollywood at a studio lunch. She's just 18 years old, fresh off her biggest movie hits, and everyone sees her as America's perfect little angel. But when Troy Donaghy walks into that room, everything changes. And in her own words from her memoir, she describes him with just 3 simple words that sent shockwaves through Hollywood. He was massive. But before we get to that jaw-dropping confession, let me tell you Sandra's incredible story from the very beginning, because what happened to this young woman will break your heart and inspire you at the same time. Sandra Dee wasn't even her real name. She was born Alexandra Zuck in 1942 in New Jersey, and from the moment she could walk, her ambitious mother Mary knew her daughter was destined for stardom. Can you imagine being pushed into modeling as a little kid? That's exactly what happened to Sandra. By the time she was barely a teenager, her face was everywhere. Girl Scout cookie boxes, Coca-Cola ads, Life magazine covers. She was making more money than most adults, but the price she paid was enormous. Behind all those perfect smiles and magazine covers, Sandra was suffering. The pressure to stay thin was crushing her spirit. She developed anorexia as a child, and this terrible disease would follow her for the rest of her life. Think about it. Here's a little girl who should be playing with dolls and riding bikes, but instead she's starving herself to fit into an image that Hollywood created for her. When Sandra was just 14 years old, she got her first movie role. Can you believe that? 14. Most kids that age are worried about homework and crushes, but Sandra was already working with famous directors and learning her lines. Her big breakthrough came with a movie called Imitation of Life in 1959, where she starred alongside the legendary Lana Turner. This film wasn't just another pretty movie. It dealt with serious topics like racism and family problems, and Sandra proved she could handle the emotional scenes just as well as any adult actress. But it was her next movie that really made her famous. A Summer Place became a cultural phenomenon, and Sandra's character Molly became the perfect example of young, innocent love. The theme song from this movie is still famous today, and whenever people heard it, they thought of Sandra's sweet face and golden curls. She had become the girl next door that every boy wanted to date and every girl wanted to be friends with. Then came Gidget, and Sandra's life changed forever. This movie created an entire new type of film, the beach party movie, and Sandra's character became the model for the perfect American teenager. She was carefree, optimistic, and always ready for adventure. Her sunny personality and beautiful blonde hair made her a household name. Teenage girls all over America wanted to look just like her, and magazines couldn't get enough of her story. But here's the thing that most people didn't understand. Sandra was trapped. The studio system in those days controlled every aspect of a star's life. They decided what movies she could make, who she could date, and even what she could say in interviews. Sandra was incredibly talented and wanted to try more challenging roles, but the studio bosses only saw her as one thing, the innocent girl next door. They wouldn't let her grow as an actress because they were making too much money from her sweet image. Throughout the early 1960s, Sandra starred in hit after hit. Movies like Tammy Tell Me True and If a Man Answers kept her at the top of the box office charts. She was consistently voted one of the most popular stars in America, and her movies were making millions of dollars. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But Sandra was starting to feel like a prisoner in her own life. In 1963, something interesting happened. Sandra starred in Take Her, She's Mine with the legendary James Stewart. This role was different because it let her show more of her personality and comedy skills. She played a young woman whose independent spirit clashed with her overprotective father. Many people think this movie showed what Sandra could have become if Hollywood had given her more chances to stretch her acting muscles. But by 1964, things were starting to change in Hollywood. The wholesome, innocent movies that made Sandra famous were going out of style. Audiences wanted grittier, more realistic films that dealt with serious social issues. Movies were becoming more rebellious, and Sandra's squeaky clean image suddenly seemed old-fashioned. Her last major studio film was A Man Could Get Killed in 1966, and it marked the end of an era for her. Now, here's where Sandra's personal life gets really interesting, and it's connected to that shocking confession about Troy Donaghy. In 1960, Sandra met and fell in love with Bobby Darin, one of the biggest pop stars in the world. Bobby was older, sophisticated, and completely different from the clean-cut boys that Sandra usually dated in her movies. Their romance was like something out of a fairy tale, the innocent movie star and the cool singer. Sandra was only 18 when she eloped with Bobby, much to her mother's horror. Their marriage was passionate and intense, but it was also troubled from the start. Bobby was constantly touring, and Sandra was trying to balance her career with being a new wife. In 1961, they had a son named Dodd, and Sandra tried to step back from acting to be a full-time mother. But the pressures of fame and their demanding careers put a huge strain on their relationship. Bobby and Sandra divorced in 1967, but they never stopped loving each other. When Bobby died suddenly in 1973 at just 37 years old, Sandra was devastated. Friends said she never got over losing him, and she never remarried. Their love story became symbolic of her entire era. Beautiful, romantic, but ultimately tragic. But here's what most people never knew about Sandra's romantic life, and this is where her memoir confession becomes absolutely shocking. During the height of her fame in 1960, Sandra had a brief but intense romance with Troy Donaghy, another major heartthrob of the era. Troy was everything that Sandra's public image wasn't supposed to be attracted to. He was dangerous, rebellious, and unpredictable. In her memoir, Sandra finally opened up about this secret relationship, and her words were absolutely electrifying. She described meeting Troy at a studio lunch, and the moment he walked in, everything changed. He was massive, she wrote, and she didn't just mean his physical size. She was talking about his overwhelming presence, his raw masculinity, and the way he completely commanded any room he entered. Sandra described how every head turned when Troy walked in, how even the air seemed to change. For a young woman who had been so carefully controlled and managed her entire life, Troy represented something completely different, pure, unfiltered excitement. She wrote about how he could say nothing at all and still make her feel everything. What started as a publicity stunt arranged by the studio quickly became something much more real and complicated. Sandra and Troy would escape from the public eye, driving along the California coast and parking by the beach just to talk. They shared their fears, their loneliness, and the incredible pressure they both felt from being famous so young. Sandra wrote that Troy understood what it meant to be adored by millions, but truly known by no one. The physical chemistry between them was intense, and Sandra hints at this in her memoir with another reference to Troy being massive, this time with a pause that suggests she meant much more than just his presence. She wrote about how he could make her forget who she was expected to be, if only for a moment. For someone who had been so tightly controlled, Troy offered a taste of rebellion and freedom. But like so many Hollywood romances, theirs burned bright and fast before fading away. The pressures of their careers and the disapproval of the people who managed their images forced them apart. Sandra wrote sadly that they were both like characters in someone else's script, never getting the chance to write their own ending. Even decades later, Sandra carried the memory of Troy with a mixture of love and regret. In one of the most beautiful passages of her memoir, she called him a beautiful, reckless storm that passed through her life. She said that even though it didn't last, she was grateful she was there to feel the rain. This revelation shows us a completely different side of Sandra Dee, not just the innocent sweetheart that everyone thought they knew, but a passionate young woman who was capable of deep, intense love. It also shows us how much the studio system controlled these young stars, not allowing them to have real relationships or make their own choices about their personal lives. As the 1960s ended and the 1970s began, Sandra's career faded along with the type of movies she was famous for. Hollywood had moved on to grittier, more rebellious films, and there wasn't much room for the wholesome girl-next-door image anymore. Sandra made a few television appearances and some low-budget films, but her days as a major star were over. Behind the scenes, Sandra was fighting battles that her fans never knew about. The pressures of early fame, childhood trauma, and her ongoing eating disorder were taking a terrible toll on her health. She also developed a serious drinking problem, and these issues fed off each other in a destructive cycle. The 1980s were particularly dark years for Sandra. After her beloved mother Mary died in 1987, Sandra went into a deep depression and became almost completely isolated from the world. She lived as a recluse, barely eating and drinking heavily. At one point, her weight dropped to a dangerous 80 pounds, and she was vomiting blood. Her son Dodd finally intervened and convinced her to get professional help. Slowly, with medical care and therapy, Sandra began to recover. She even talked about maybe returning to acting, not in movies, but in a television comedy show. She said she wanted to be part of a family again, even if it was just a pretend family on TV. Unfortunately, this comeback never happened, but it showed that Sandra still had hope and still wanted to connect with people. Sandra's years of heavy drinking and smoking eventually caught up with her. In 2000, she was diagnosed with kidney failure and had to go on dialysis. She completely stopped drinking and fought bravely to stay alive for 4 more years. On February 20th, 2005, Sandra passed away from kidney disease at a hospital in California. She was 62 years old. Sandra Dee's story is both heartbreaking and inspiring. She started as a little girl who was pushed in to fame before she was ready, became one of the biggest stars in the world, experienced passionate love and devastating loss, and ultimately faced her demons with quiet courage. Her confession about Troy Donaghy gives us a glimpse into the real woman behind the innocent image, someone who was capable of deep passion and wasn't afraid to take emotional risks. The tragedy of Sandra's story is that she was never really allowed to be herself. The studio system, her ambitious mother, and the demands of fame all combined to create an image that trapped her. She was so much more than just the sweet, wholesome character she played in movies, but the world wasn't ready to see that other side of her. Today, Sandra Dee is remembered not just as a movie star, but as a symbol of both the glamour and the dark side of Hollywood's golden age. Her story reminds us that behind every perfect image is a real person with real struggles, real dreams, and real love. Her revelation about Troy Donaghy shows us that even America's sweetheart had secrets, had passion, and had a side of her that was anything but innocent. The fact that she waited until her memoir to reveal the truth about her relationship with Troy shows just how controlled her public life had been. For decades, she kept this beautiful, intense love story to herself, probably because she knew it didn't fit with the image that everyone expected her to maintain. Sandra's story teaches us about the price of fame, especially for young people who become stars before they're old enough to handle the pressure. It also shows us the importance of being true to ourselves and not letting others define who we are. Sandra may have been trapped by her image for most of her career, but in the end, she found the courage to tell her own story in her own words. Her confession that Troy Donaghy was massive wasn't just about one man or one relationship. It was about acknowledging that she had been a real woman with real desires, not just the innocent character that Hollywood created. It was her way of finally claiming her own story and showing the world that there had always been more to Sandra Dee than met the eye. If you found Sandra Dee's incredible story as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and share this video with your friends. Her story deserves to be told, and her courage in finally revealing the truth about her life should inspire all of us to live authentically. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible Hollywood stories that go beyond the headlines and show you the real people behind the famous names. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.